Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward. Tell me, is your lamp lit? Your tea near at hand? These are the hours when Dr. Watson would settle by the fire, notebook open, reflecting on all that reason had revealed. Victorian nights rewarded patience, and so shall this one. Do subscribe so no mystery passes you by. Now rest easy, for as Holmes knew well, the truth hides not in drama, but in what quietly refuses to fit. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Ravenscroft. It was upon a bitter evening in the early days of February that my friend Sherlock Holmes received the letter which was to draw us into one of the most singular cases of his career. The winter had been uncommonly severe that year, and London lay beneath a blanket of snow that showed no sign of relenting. I had taken refuge in our sitting room at Baker Street, where a generous fire crackled in the grate, and was engaged in reading the evening paper when Holmes emerged from his bedroom with the morning's correspondence still in hand. He had been unusually quiet throughout the day, a certain restlessness in his manner suggesting that the enforced idleness of the season weighed heavily upon his active mind. Now, however, as he settled into his armchair and began to examine a particular envelope with that peculiar intensity I knew so well, I observed a marked change in his demeanour. "Watson," said he without looking up, "how do you fancy a journey into the countryside?" "In this weather," I replied, gesturing toward the frosted window panes. "I should think it inadvisable, Holmes. The railways are barely running, and the roads must be quite impassable." "Precisely the conditions under which interesting problems arise," he remarked, his eyes gleaming with sudden animation. "When men are isolated from the ordinary mechanisms of society, their true natures have a tendency to reveal themselves. Read this, if you will." He passed me a letter written upon heavy cream-coloured paper. The hand was educated but tremulous, suggesting either advanced age or considerable agitation. I reproduce its contents as accurately as memory permits. "My dear Mr. Holmes," the letter began, "I write to you upon a matter of the most peculiar and unsettling nature. Though I am a man of science and reason, trained in the classical disciplines and not given to fancies, I find myself confronted by circumstances which defy rational explanation. I possess, as you may perhaps know, a medieval manuscript of considerable historical value, which has been in my family's keeping for 3 generations. This document is housed in the library of my estate, Ravenscroft Manor in Derbyshire. Of late, this library has become the site of disturbances which occur with disturbing regularity at the stroke of midnight. Footsteps are heard, pages are turned, yet when the room is entered, it is always found to be empty and securely locked from within. I would not trouble you with what might seem mere superstition, were it not that these phenomena have begun to affect the nerves of my household, and I fear for the safety of the manuscript itself. The roads to my estate are difficult in winter, but if you would consent to make the journey, I should be profoundly grateful. I remain, sir, your humble servant, Lionel Ravenscroft." "Well, Watson," said Holmes when I had finished reading, "what do you make of it?" "It reads like a ghost story," I admitted. "Footsteps at midnight in a locked room. I confess I'm sceptical." "As am I," Holmes replied, rising to pace before the fireplace. "Yet Sir Lionel Ravenscroft is not unknown to me by reputation. He is a respected scholar of medieval history, a fellow of antiquarian societies, and precisely the sort of mind that would resist supernatural explanations. That such a man writes to me suggests he has exhausted more conventional possibilities." "Then you mean to accept?" "I have already sent a telegram indicating our arrival tomorrow." "Evening, weather permitting," said he with a slight smile. "Mrs. Hudson is arranging for our bags to be packed. I trust you have no pressing engagements." I had none, and truth be told, the prospect of escape from London's grey monotony appealed to me greatly. The following afternoon found us aboard a train crawling northward through a landscape transformed by snow into something strange and dreamlike. Holmes spent the journey in contemplative silence, smoking his pipe and staring out at the frozen fields, while I occupied myself with a novel. We changed trains twice, each connection more uncertain than the last, and it was nearly dark when we finally alighted at a small country station. A closed carriage awaited us, its driver muffled against the cold, and we began the final stage of our journey along narrow lanes banked high with snow. Ravenscroft Manor, when at last it came into view, presented a striking aspect. It stood upon elevated ground overlooking moorland that stretched away into gathering darkness, a substantial house of grey stone with mullioned windows and twisted chimneys that spoke of considerable age. Light glowed from several windows, warm and welcoming against the bitter night, yet there was something in the isolation of the place, the way it seemed to crouch against the wind, that stirred an inexplicable uneasiness within me. We were admitted by a dignified woman of middle years whom I took to be the housekeeper. She introduced herself as Mrs. Penbury, and conducted us through a panelled entrance hall to a drawing-room where Sir Lionel Ravenscroft rose to greet us. He was a man of perhaps 70 years, tall and spare, with a scholar's stoop and keen grey eyes beneath bushy brows. His manner was courteous and cultured, though I detected an underlying anxiety in the way his hands occasionally trembled. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you cannot know how grateful I am that you have made this difficult journey," he said, clasping Holmes's hand. "The roads have worsened considerably since I wrote. I fear you may be our guests rather longer than anticipated." "So much the better for our investigation," Holmes replied. "Isolation has its advantages when one seeks truth undisturbed by outside interference." Over dinner we were introduced to the other members of the household. Miss Eleanor Ravenscroft, Sir Lionel's niece, was a composed woman of perhaps 30, with intelligent dark eyes and a manner that suggested both education and self-possession. Professor Gideon Hale, a visiting historian from Cambridge, proved to be an enthusiastic conversationalist with particular expertise in medieval manuscripts. Mr. Victor Ashcombe, the estate steward, was a capable-looking man of middle age who spoke little, but observed much. Captain Douglas Harrow, introduced as an old family friend lately retired from military service in India, completed our company. He was a weathered, forthright man whose stories of the frontier formed the principal entertainment of the meal. Throughout dinner, I observed Holmes watching each person with that peculiar stillness that indicated his mind was cataloguing every gesture and inflection. He contributed little to the conversation beyond what courtesy required, but I knew that behind his apparent ease, his remarkable faculties were already at work. It was only after the ladies had withdrawn and the port was circulating that Sir Lionel broached the subject that had brought us to Ravenscroft Manor. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice dropping to a more serious tone, "I believe it is time I explained more fully the nature of the disturbances that plague my library. The room in question lies in the oldest part of the house. It is called the Midnight Library, though that name dates only from recent weeks. The manuscript I mentioned is housed there in a locked glass cabinet, and the room itself is secured each evening at 10 o'clock. Yet at midnight, precisely at the stroke of 12, there come sounds of movement from within, footsteps, the rustling of pages. Once, a distinct crash, as of furniture overturned." "You have investigated immediately upon hearing these sounds?" Holmes inquired. "Upon every occasion," Sir Lionel replied. "The room is always found locked from the inside, exactly as it was left. Nothing is disturbed. The manuscript remains secure. And yet, Mr. Holmes, the sounds are unmistakable. Others have heard them as well. I am not the victim of my own imagination." "I should very much like to examine this library," said Holmes, "if that might be arranged." "Certainly," Sir Lionel agreed, "though I confess I am at a loss to know what you may find there. I have searched it thoroughly myself." As we rose from the table, I glanced toward the tall windows and observed that the snow had begun to fall again with renewed intensity. The wind had risen as well, rattling the ancient casements and moaning in the chimneys. We were, I reflected, truly cut off from the wider world, trapped in this isolated house with whatever mystery it contained. Holmes caught my eye and smiled faintly, as though he had read my thoughts. "Excellent conditions, Watson," he murmured as we followed Sir Lionel toward the library. "Excellent conditions indeed." I could not share his satisfaction, for a curious presentiment had settled upon me, a sense that we stood upon the threshold of something stranger than either of us yet imagined. Chapter 2. The Library at Midnight. Sir Lionel led us through a succession of corridors that grew progressively narrower and more ancient in character. The newer portions of Ravenscroft Manor gave way to passages where the stone walls were exposed and the floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Electric lighting had not yet reached this part of the house, and our host carried a lamp whose flickering flame cast dancing shadows that seemed almost alive. "This wing dates to the 15th century, Sir Lionel explained as we walked. The library was originally a scriptorium where monks copied manuscripts. After the dissolution, my ancestor acquired the property and converted it to its present purpose. The room has remained largely unaltered for 400 years. We arrived at last before a heavy oaken door bound with iron straps, its surface dark with age. Sir Lionel produced a large key from his waistcoat pocket and fitted it to the lock. The mechanism turned with a solid click that echoed in the confined space. "You will observe," said Holmes, who had been examining the door with minute attention, "that this lock is of considerable age but excellent quality. There are no scratches upon it to suggest tampering, nor any signs that it has been forced." "None whatsoever," Sir Lionel confirmed. "I have examined it myself on numerous occasions." The door swung inward with a faint groan, and we entered the midnight library. It was a chamber of modest dimensions, perhaps 20 feet square, with a vaulted ceiling supported by ancient beams. 3 of the walls were lined from floor to ceiling with shelves bearing leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked and faded. The 4th wall was dominated by 2 tall windows, their leaded panes revealing nothing beyond but darkness and falling snow. Between the windows stood a substantial glass cabinet, and within it, resting upon a cushion of faded velvet, lay what I took to be the manuscript in question. A writing desk occupied the centre of the room, with a single chair positioned before it. A small fireplace was set into one wall, though it had clearly not been used for many years, its opening sealed by an iron plate. The air was cold and still, carrying the distinctive scent of old paper and leather. Holmes stood motionless just inside the doorway, his sharp eyes travelling methodically across every surface. I had witnessed this process countless times before, yet it never failed to impress me. Where I saw merely an old library, he was reading a text invisible to ordinary eyes, noting details that would prove significant only in retrospect. "The windows," he said at length. "They are barred on the inside, I perceive." "Indeed," Sir Lionel replied. "Iron bars set into the stone itself. They have been there since the room's construction. The windows have not been opened in my lifetime." Holmes crossed to examine them more closely. The bars were indeed formidable, and the frames, when he tested them, proved to be painted shut and sealed with years of accumulated grime. Snow had drifted against the outer panes, confirming that no one had approached from outside. "And the fireplace?" Holmes inquired, turning his attention to the sealed opening. "It has been closed these 30 years or more," Sir Lionel explained. "The chimney developed a dangerous crack, and rather than undertake expensive repairs, my father simply had it sealed. The flue is completely blocked with masonry." Holmes produced his magnifying glass and subjected the iron plate to careful scrutiny. He ran his fingers along its edges, then examined his fingertips in the lamplight before brushing them clean with his handkerchief. "Most interesting," he murmured, though he did not elaborate. Next, he approached the glass cabinet containing the manuscript. It was secured with a small but sturdy lock, and the glass itself appeared thick and unblemished. "This is the Codex Ravenscroft?" Holmes asked. "It is," Sir Lionel confirmed with evident pride. "A psalter dating to the 13th century, illuminated by a master whose identity remains unknown. It is one of only 3 such manuscripts known to exist." Even through the glass, I could discern the extraordinary beauty of the pages visible within, Gold leaf caught the lamplight, and intricate borders of interwoven vines and fantastical creatures framed text written in an elegant medieval hand. Its value would be considerable, I presume, Holmes observed. Beyond price, in truth, Sir Lionel replied quietly. Several institutions have made offers over the years, but it has been in my family since the 16th century. I could no more sell it than I could sell my own history. Holmes bent to examine the floor beneath the cabinet, then traced a path across the room with his eyes, occasionally dropping to one knee to inspect the worn floorboards more closely. At the writing desk he paused to study the chair, which I now noticed faced away from the cabinet toward the opposite wall. "You work at this desk, Sir Lionel?" he inquired. "I do, though not frequently in recent weeks. I confess the atmosphere has become somewhat oppressive. And this chair, you positioned it thus yourself?" "I?" Sir Lionel appeared puzzled. "No, indeed. I always face the desk toward the window for the natural light. I cannot think how it came to be turned about." Holmes said nothing, but produced a small notebook and made several rapid annotations. He then began a methodical examination of the bookshelves, removing volumes at random and peering into the spaces behind them. Several times he paused to smell the air, a habit of his that had long since ceased to surprise me. It was while he was thus engaged that he made a sound of satisfaction and beckoned me closer. He indicated a shelf at roughly shoulder height, where a slight gap in the accumulated dust showed that books had recently been disturbed. "Someone has examined these volumes within the past few days," he said in a low voice. "See here, Watson, the dust is quite thick elsewhere, yet here it has been partially removed by the passage of hands reaching behind the books." "Perhaps Sir Lionel himself," I suggested. "Perhaps," Holmes agreed, though his tone suggested he thought otherwise. "We shall see." He continued his examination with undiminished energy, occasionally making notes or muttering observations that meant nothing to me. Near one of the windows he stopped abruptly and knelt to retrieve something from the floor. It was, so far as I could determine, a small fragment of candle wax. "There are candles in the room, surely," I ventured. "There are," Holmes replied, indicating a pair of brass candlesticks upon the desk. "But observe, Watson, the candles currently in those holders are of plain tallow, yellowish in colour and of inferior quality. This fragment, however, is of refined wax, whiter and of finer composition. Someone has burned superior candles in this room quite recently." "The difference seems trivial," I admitted. "On the contrary, it is highly suggestive. Sir Lionel, I observe, is a man of refined taste and adequate means. The candles presently in evidence are servants' candles, not what one would expect to find in his private library. The question naturally arises, why were they replaced, and when?" Sir Lionel, who had been listening with growing interest, shook his head. "I cannot account for it, Mr. Holmes. Mrs. Penbury manages such household matters. I confess I pay little attention to the type of candles employed." Holmes made another note, then stood in the centre of the room and slowly turned full circle, his eyes half closed in concentration. I knew this attitude well. He was constructing a mental picture of the space, cataloguing every detail for future reference. "I should like to spend some time alone in this room," he said at length. "If you would be so kind as to leave me the lamp, Sir Lionel, I believe I shall remain here until midnight." "You intend to await the disturbance?" I asked. "I intend to observe," Holmes corrected gently. "There is a difference. Watson, you need not remain. I suspect it will be a dull vigil, and your leg pains you in this cold. I observed you favouring it on the stairs. It was true, though I had thought I concealed it well. The old wound from Maiwand always troubled me in bitter weather." "Nevertheless," I said firmly, "I shall stay." Holmes smiled briefly. "I expected no less. Very well. Sir Lionel, we shall secure the door from within and trouble you no further tonight. Perhaps you would be good enough to have Mrs. Penbury send up some coffee, and whatever cold provisions might be available. It promises to be a long night." Sir Lionel departed with evident relief at being excused from the vigil. We heard his footsteps receding down the corridor, then the house fell silent around us. Holmes immediately resumed his examination with renewed intensity, paying particular attention to the narrow space beneath the door, where a faint draught stirred the dust. "There is air movement," he observed, "which is curious in a room so sealed. The draught is slight but perceptible. From what source, I wonder?" He spent the next quarter hour tracing the air current with a candle flame, watching how it flickered and bent. His investigation led him back to the sealed fireplace, where he again examined the iron plate with minute care. "Most suggestive," he murmured. "Most suggestive indeed." But he would say no more, and when the coffee arrived, brought by a nervous housemaid who clearly wished to be elsewhere, he settled into the chair at the desk and assumed an attitude of patient waiting. The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. The house around us grew quiet as its inhabitants retired for the night. The wind continued its assault upon the ancient windows, and somewhere in the distance a clock began to chime the 3/4 hour. Holmes sat motionless, his eyes fixed upon the glass cabinet, while I struggled to remain alert in my chair by the door. As the clock struck midnight, I held my breath and waited. Chapter 3: The Impossible Disturbance. The 12 strokes of midnight died away into silence, leaving only the wind's persistent moan and the occasional creak of ancient timbers settling in the cold. Holmes remained absolutely still, his profile sharp against the lamplight, every faculty concentrated upon the room, around us. Minutes passed. Nothing stirred. I began to wonder whether the phenomena Sir Lionel had described were perhaps less reliable than he believed. The product of an elderly man's overwrought imagination, amplified by isolation and the peculiar acoustics of an old house. Yet even as the thought formed, I dismissed it. Sir Lionel had impressed me as a man of exceptional clarity and judgment, not one given to flights of fancy. We waited in a silence broken only by the ticking of my pocket watch, which seemed unnaturally loud in that closed space. Holmes had not moved for nearly 20 minutes when I saw his head tilt slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture that I had learned to recognize as indicating heightened attention. "Do you hear it, Watson?" he whispered. I strained my ears but could detect nothing beyond the sounds I had already noted. I shook my head. "Patience," he murmured. Then, faintly, so faintly that I could not be certain it was not merely the wind playing, tricks upon my senses, I heard what might have been footsteps. They seemed to come from within the very walls, a soft, deliberate tread that advanced and then stopped. Holmes rose silently from his chair. The sound, if sound it was, had ceased as suddenly as it began. We stood motionless for perhaps 5 minutes more, but the library remained undisturbed, and gradually I convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. "We shall maintain our vigil," Holmes said quietly, resuming his seat. The hours that followed tested my endurance severely. The cold penetrated my bones despite my coat, and the absolute stillness of our surroundings began to induce a curious lethargy. I must confess that my head nodded more than once, though I fought against the insidious pull of sleep. It was perhaps 3 o'clock when Holmes finally stirred and suggested we retire. We secured the library door carefully behind us and made our way through the silent house to our respective chambers. I fell into bed exhausted and slept without dreams until late morning. When I descended to breakfast, I found the household already assembled and engaged in animated conversation. Holmes was not among them, and I learned from Miss Ravenscroft that he had risen early and requested permission to examine the exterior of the house, despite the continuing snowfall. "Your friend appears to take his investigations most seriously," observed Professor Hale, who was working his way through a substantial portion of Kippers. "I confess I am eager to learn his conclusions." "Holmes never draws conclusions prematurely," I replied, helping myself to coffee from the sideboard. It was while we were thus engaged that we heard a cry from somewhere above, followed by rapid footsteps descending the main staircase. A moment later Sir Lionel burst into the breakfast room, his face ashen and his hands trembling. "The manuscript!" he gasped. "It is gone!" We rushed as one body to the midnight library. "Sir, Lionel produced his key with shaking hands and threw open the door. The room appeared exactly as we had left it hours before, yet the glass cabinet that had housed the Codex Ravenscroft now stood empty, its door hanging open. But it was not the missing manuscript that arrested my attention. Lying across the floor before the cabinet was a ladder of the sort used by servants to reach high shelves. It had clearly fallen, for one of the candlesticks from the desk had been knocked to the floor beside it. "This was not here when we left," I stated with certainty. "Indeed it was not," came Holmes's voice from behind us. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his coat dusted with snow, and his keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene. "I secured the door myself at 3 o'clock this morning, and the room was precisely as we had found it initially. The ladder was in its customary place in the outer corridor." Sir Lionel had sunk into the chair at the desk, his head in his hands. "I do not understand," he said weakly. "How is this possible? You had the only other key, Mr. Holmes. The windows are barred. How could anyone have entered?" Holmes did not immediately reply. He was examining the ladder with his glass, paying particular attention to the dust that still clung to its rungs and uprights. He then knelt to study the floor beneath it, running his fingers across the boards with that delicate touch that characterized all his investigations. "Curious," he murmured. "Most curious indeed." "What have you found?" I asked. "What I have found, Watson, is an absence. Observe the dust beneath this ladder. It is undisturbed, lying in an even layer exactly as it has presumably lain for months. Yet the ladder itself has supposedly fallen, which should have scattered or compressed the dust beneath it." "Then it was placed there after it fell?" suggested Captain Harrow, who had been examining the empty cabinet. "Or it never fell at all," Holmes replied. "It was positioned to create that impression." He turned his attention to the glass cabinet. The lock showed no signs of forcing, and the small key that should have secured it was nowhere to be found. "Sir Lionel," Holmes inquired, "where do you keep the key to this cabinet?" "In my study," our host replied, "in a locked drawer of my desk. I checked it this very morning before breakfast. It was there, exactly where it should be." "And yet the cabinet is unlocked. Either someone obtained access to your study and replaced the key after using it, or they possessed a duplicate." Holmes paused, examining the lock mechanism closely. "Or, of course, they employed some other means of opening the cabinet that left no trace." Mr. Ashcombe, the estate steward, had been making his own examination of the room. "The windows remain secure," he reported. "The snow outside is entirely undisturbed. No one has approached from without." "Then they must have entered through the door," said Professor Hale. "But how, when it was locked from the outside and the key in Sir Lionel's possession?" "An excellent question," Holmes agreed. He withdrew from his pocket the large iron key that Sir Lionel had entrusted to him the previous night. "This key has not left my person since I locked the door at 3 o'clock this morning. I'm a light sleeper, and my room shows no signs of having been entered. Moreover, I took the precaution of placing a hair across the keyhole before I retired. It remained undisturbed when I checked at dawn." "Then it is impossible," Miss Ravenscroft said quietly. "The manuscript cannot have been taken." "And yet it has been," Holmes observed, "which suggests that our understanding of what is possible requires revision." He had moved to the fireplace and was once again examining the sealed opening with minute attention. The iron plate remained firmly in place, its edges sealed with what appeared to be years of accumulated paint and grime. "The chimney, you said, was blocked with masonry?" Holmes asked Sir Lionel. "Completely. The work was done under my father's supervision. I was present myself when the flue was filled with rubble and mortar." Holmes produced a penknife and carefully scraped at the edge of the iron plate. A fine grey powder fell to the floor. "Soot," he observed. "Fresh soot, or relatively so. Not the accumulation of years, but of weeks, perhaps months." "But that is impossible," Sir Lionel protested. "No fire has been lit in that grate for 3 decades. "Impossible seems to be the governing principle of this case," Holmes replied dryly. He stood and brushed the dust from his knees. "Watson, you observed that the chair at the desk faces away from the cabinet." "I did. Sir Lionel mentioned it yesterday evening." "Indeed. and I now observe that it has been moved again. When we left at 3 o'clock, I distinctly recall it was positioned as we found it initially, facing the wall. Now it has been turned to face the cabinet, as though someone sat here and watched the theft unfold. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The image of an unseen observer sitting in darkness, watching as the manuscript was spirited away, was deeply unsettling. Holmes walked slowly to the centre of the room and stood in silence for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of satisfaction that I found surprising given the circumstances. "We face not a miracle," he said, addressing the assembled company, "but a misdirection. Someone has taken considerable care to present us with an impossibility, and in doing so, they have revealed more than they perhaps intended." "You know who has done this?" Sir Lionel asked, rising from his chair with sudden hope. "I have certain theories," Holmes replied carefully, "but they require testing. For now, I must ask that nothing in this room be disturbed further. The snow has stopped, I observe, but the roads will not be passable for several days yet. Our thief, whoever they may be, remains within these walls. That is to our advantage." "How can you be certain the thief is still here?" Professor Hale inquired. Holmes gestured toward the windows. "Because the snow, while it has ceased falling, lies in drifts that have been accumulating for 3 days. No one could have departed this house since yesterday afternoon without leaving tracks that would be immediately visible. I have examined the perimeter myself this morning. There are no such tracks." He turned to face us all, and I saw in his expression that peculiar intensity that indicated his faculties were fully engaged. "The manuscript is somewhere in Ravenscroft Manor," he declared, "and before this day is out I intend to discover precisely where." The confidence in his voice was reassuring, yet I could not shake the feeling that we stood in the presence of a more subtle intelligence than any of us yet suspected. Someone in this house had achieved the impossible, and they had done so while Holmes himself stood guard. It was, I reflected uneasily, a most inauspicious beginning to our investigation. Chapter 4. The Errors of Assumption. The remainder of that morning passed in a state of considerable agitation among the household. Sir Lionel retired to his study in evident distress, while the other guests gathered in small groups to discuss the inexplicable theft. Holmes, meanwhile, had returned to the library and shut himself within, refusing all company save mine. I found him lying upon the floor, his magnifying glass in hand, examining the boards with such concentration that he did not acknowledge my entrance for several minutes. When at last he rose, dusting off his knees, his expression was one of quiet satisfaction. "Watson," he said, "I have been guilty of a most elementary error. I allowed myself to be distracted by the theatrical elements of this affair when I should have been attending to its mundane realities. Confess I do not follow you, Holmes." "Consider the ladder," he replied, gesturing toward where it still lay across the floor. "It has been positioned to suggest that someone climbed it to reach the cabinet, then fell, creating the crash that was heard. Yet, as I noted earlier, the dust beneath it is undisturbed. What does that tell us? That it was placed there after the theft was complete. Precisely. But why? If the thief had already secured the manuscript and departed the room, what purpose would such staging serve?" He did not wait for my answer. "It serves to fix our attention upon a particular narrative, to encourage us to ask how someone could have entered and climbed this ladder when the room was locked. We are meant to puzzle over the impossibility of the ladder's presence rather than question whether it was ever used at all." He crossed to the desk and indicated the fallen candlestick. "This too is part of the performance. A crash was heard, therefore something must have fallen. The candlestick provides a convenient explanation, yet observe how it lies." I examined the brass candlestick where it rested against the leg of the desk. It appeared unremarkable to my eyes. "The candle remains in its socket," Holmes pointed out, "unbroken and barely displaced. Had this candlestick truly been knocked from the desk by a falling ladder, the candle would almost certainly have been dislodged. Instead, it sits quite securely, suggesting the candlestick was placed on the floor with some care." He moved to the glass cabinet and spent several minutes examining its lock and hinges. The cabinet was opened with a key, not forced. The question is whose key? Sir Lionel maintains his was in the locked drawer of his desk. Either he is mistaken, or someone gained access to his study. Or possessed a duplicate, I suggested. Quite so. I shall need to examine Sir Lionel's key at the first opportunity. Holmes paused, his fingers drumming against the edge of the cabinet in a gesture that indicated intense thought. There is something else, Watson. Come, look at this. He directed my attention to the interior of the cabinet, where the velvet cushion that had supported the manuscript still bore a faint impression of its weight. What do you observe? He asked. I studied the cushion carefully. The impression is quite clear. The manuscript must have rested there for some considerable time. Indeed, and now observe the dust upon the shelves surrounding the cabinet. He indicated a fine layer of grey powder that covered most surfaces in the room. It is uniform throughout, suggesting the room has not been thoroughly cleaned in some weeks. Yet inside the cabinet there is almost no dust at all. The cabinet was kept locked, I ventured. Perhaps that preserved it from dust accumulation. An excellent hypothesis, Watson, yet easily disproved. See here, along the bottom edge of the cabinet interior. There is dust, though less than elsewhere. A sealed cabinet would prevent all dust or none. This pattern suggests the cabinet has been opened within recent days, perhaps several times, allowing some dust to enter while the majority was kept out. Then someone had been accessing the manuscript before last night. So it would appear. The question is whether Sir Lionel was aware of these visits, or whether they were conducted without his knowledge. Holmes continued his methodical examination, paying particular attention to elements I had barely noticed. He discovered that several of the candle drippings on the desk did not match the tallow candles currently in the holders, confirming his earlier observation about the superior wax. He noted minute scratches around the keyhole of the door that suggested it had been locked, and unlocked with some frequency, though whether by Sir Lionel or another could not be determined. It was while he was examining the bookshelves that a knock came at the door. Captain Harrow entered at Holmes's invitation, his weathered face troubled. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "I feel I must speak with you. There is a matter that may have some bearing on your investigation, though I hesitate to cast aspersions without proof." "Please," Holmes said, indicating the chair at the desk. "Speak freely." Harrow settled himself with the stiffness of a man accustomed to military discipline. "It concerns the windows of this room. You have noted that they are barred and apparently unopenable. However, I observed something this morning that struck me as odd. The latch on the eastern window appeared loose, as though it had been recently disturbed." Holmes immediately crossed to the window in question. He examined the latch with his glass, then tested it gently. It moved under his touch, though only slightly. "It is indeed loose," he confirmed. "Yet the window itself remains sealed. The paint around the frame is undisturbed, and the accumulation of grime suggests it has not been opened in years." "Still," Harrow persisted, "might someone have attempted to open it from outside?" "In what manner?" Holmes asked. "The bars would prevent access even if the window could be opened, and as Mr. Ashcombe observed, the snow outside shows no footprints. Nevertheless, I am grateful for your vigilance, Captain." After Harrow had departed, Holmes spent several minutes examining the loose latch, making notes in his pocketbook. "Another element designed to mislead," he murmured. "Someone has deliberately loosened this latch, knowing it would be discovered and would suggest an attempt at entry from outside, yet the physical evidence makes such an entry impossible." The afternoon brought fresh complications. Mr. Ashcombe appeared at the library door, his capable features set in lines of concern. "Mr. Holmes, I wonder if I might have a word. It is rather delicate." "Of course," Holmes replied, gesturing him inside. Ashcombe hesitated, then spoke in a lowered voice. "I have managed the Ravenscroft estate for 15 years, and I pride myself on knowing all that occurs within these walls. This morning, while making my rounds, I discovered something that disturbs me considerably. There are muddy boot prints in the rear hallway, near the servants' entrance. They were not there last evening." "Whose boots made them?" Holmes inquired. That is what troubles me. They match the pattern of Captain Harrow's boots. I recognised them because he asked me yesterday to have them cleaned, and I noted the distinctive wear pattern on the soles. Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. And you are certain these prints were not present yesterday evening? Quite certain. I passed through that hallway myself at 9 o'clock to secure the outer door. The floor was clean. Has Captain Harrow been outside this morning? Not that I am aware. The snow only ceased an hour ago, and I have seen no one venture out save yourself. After Ashcombe departed, Holmes stood for a long moment, in silent contemplation. The evidence accumulates, he said at length, yet it points in too many directions. We have loose window latches, mysterious boot prints, superior candle wax, and freshly disturbed soot from a sealed chimney. Each fact suggests a different narrative. Perhaps several people are involved, I suggested, or perhaps one very clever person is attempting to create precisely that impression. Holmes began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. Consider, Watson. We have a locked room from which a priceless manuscript has vanished. The theft occurred while I was ostensibly guarding the door. The physical impossibility of the crime is emphasized by multiple contradictory clues, each suggesting a different method of entry that is ultimately proved impossible. You believe these clues were planted deliberately? I am certain of it. Someone wishes us to waste time investigating boot prints and window latches and falling ladders. They wish us to suspect multiple parties and to question the reliability of locks and bars. In short, they wish us to believe that the theft is more mysterious than it actually is. But surely the mystery is genuine, I protested. The manuscript is gone, yet the room was locked. The manuscript is gone, Holmes agreed. But I am no longer convinced the room was locked when it disappeared. He raised a hand to forestall my objection. I do not mean that someone picked the lock or obtained a key, Watson. I mean something rather more fundamental. I believe the manuscript was removed from this room before our vigil began, and everything that has occurred since has been an elaborate performance designed to obscure that simple fact. I stared at him in astonishment. But you examined the cabinet yourself yesterday evening. The manuscript was there. I saw something in the cabinet, Holmes corrected gently, in poor light, through glass, from a distance. I did not open the cabinet and examine its contents closely. I assumed what I saw was the Codex Ravenscroft because that is what I expected to see. It is an assumption I now deeply regret. He turned to face me fully, and I saw in his expression a mixture of chagrin and determination. We have been most expertly deceived, my dear Watson, but our adversary has made mistakes, as all adversaries must. The very complexity of their deception reveals an underlying anxiety, a fear that simple theft would be too easily traced. They have created a locked room mystery where none was needed, and in doing so, they have given us the means to unravel their scheme. Then you know who took the manuscript? I have suspicions, he replied carefully. But suspicions are not proof. Before I can act, I must understand not merely who, but how and why. The how is becoming clearer. The why remains obscure. He crossed to the window and stood gazing out at the snow-covered landscape, his sharp profile silhouetted against the grey afternoon light. Tomorrow, he said quietly, I shall interview each member of this household in turn. Someone here knows more than they have revealed, and I intend to discover what that knowledge is. In the meantime, Watson, I suggest we join the others for tea. There is nothing more to be learned from this room today. As we descended toward the drawing-room, I found myself reviewing all that Holmes had revealed. The staged ladder, the planted clues, the assumption that the manuscript had been present when first we viewed the library. It was brilliant reasoning, yet it raised as many questions as it answered. Who among the seemingly respectable inhabitants of Ravenscroft Manor possessed both the cunning to devise such a scheme and the audacity to execute it under Holmes's very nose? I suspected that the answer, when it came, would surprise us all. Chapter 5. Conversations in Lamplight. The following morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. I rose early to find Holmes already at breakfast, absorbed in a small notebook in which he had been recording his observations. He looked up as I entered and gestured toward the coffee pot with a slight smile. "I trust you slept well, Watson. I fear the coming day will test your patience. I intend to speak with each member of the household individually, and such conversations tend to be lengthy affairs." "You believe one of them will reveal themselves through their words?" I asked, taking the seat opposite him. "Not directly, perhaps, but people reveal themselves in many ways beyond their explicit statements. A hesitation before answering, a glance toward the door, the particular phrases they choose when describing events. These small signals often prove more illuminating than any confession." He had arranged to use Sir Lionel's study for his interviews, a comfortable room lined with books and warmed by a generous fire. Sir Lionel himself was the first to attend upon Holmes's summons, arriving promptly at 9 o'clock with the bearing of a man steeling himself for an ordeal. I observed this interview from a chair positioned somewhat to the side, where I could see both Holmes and his subject without being obtrusive. Holmes began with questions about the manuscript itself, its history and value, allowing Sir Lionel to speak at length about his family's custodianship of the treasure. "You mentioned in your letter," Holmes said, once this preliminary ground had been covered, "that the disturbances began only recently. Can you recall precisely when they first occurred?" Sir Lionel considered carefully. "It was perhaps 3 weeks ago, no more. I was working late in my study when I heard what sounded like footsteps from the direction of the library. I went to investigate but found the door locked, exactly as I had left it." "You investigated alone?" "I did. Mrs. Penbury was already retired, and I saw no reason to alarm the household over what might have been settling timbers or the wind. Yet the sounds recurred?" "They did, always at midnight, always the same pattern. Footsteps, then a period of silence, then what sounded like pages being turned. It was most unsettling." Holmes made a note. "During these 3 weeks, did you ever open the library door immediately upon hearing the sounds?" Sir Lionel shifted in his chair. "I confess I did not. The sounds ceased so quickly, and by the time I'd retrieved my key and reached the door, all was silent. It seemed pointless to disturb the room when nothing appeared amiss. Until the night before our arrival, when you heard a crash." "Precisely. That was what prompted me to write to you. The earlier sounds had been merely mysterious. The crash suggested something more physical, more threatening." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together. "One final question, Sir Lionel. The key to the manuscript cabinet. You keep it in a locked drawer in this very desk?" "I do." Sir Lionel withdrew a small key from his waistcoat and unlocked a drawer, revealing another smaller key within. "Here it is, exactly where it always rests." "And this drawer? Who else knows of its contents?" "No one to my knowledge. I am a private man, Mr. Holmes. I do not discuss the security arrangements for my possessions." After Sir Lionel had departed, Holmes examined the desk drawer with his glass, paying particular attention to the lock. "Well oiled and recently used," he murmured, yet showing no signs of forcing. He pocketed the smaller key. "I shall return this shortly, but first I wish to test something." Miss Eleanor Ravenscroft arrived for her interview precisely on time, her manner composed and her dark eyes alert. She seated herself with natural grace and waited for Holmes to begin. "Miss Ravenscroft," he said, "you reside here permanently with your uncle?" "I have done so for the past 5 years since my father's death. Uncle Lionel was kind enough to offer me a home, and I serve as his companion and assist him with his correspondence." "A role that must bring you into frequent contact with his scholarly work?" "Indeed. I often help him with research, locating references and copying passages from texts. I have developed something of an interest in medieval manuscripts myself." Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. "Then you would be familiar with the Codex Ravenscroft." "I have examined it many times," she replied without hesitation. "It is a remarkable work. The illuminations are particularly fine." "When did you last view it?" There was the briefest pause before she answered. "Perhaps a week ago. Uncle Lionel opened the cabinet to show a detail to Professor Hale, and I was present. Professor Hale has been a guest here for how long? He arrived 10 days ago. He's writing a monograph on medieval psalters and requested permission to study our manuscript. Your uncle granted this permission readily? He did. Professor Hale came with excellent credentials, and Uncle Lionel enjoys scholarly discourse. Holmes made several notes, then asked almost casually, "During the night of the theft, Miss Ravenscroft, where were you between the hours of 11 and 1? "In my room, asleep. I retire early as a general rule." "Did you hear anything unusual? The crash, for instance, that apparently came from the library?" She shook her head. "My room is in the east wing, quite distant from the library. I heard nothing until the following morning when Uncle Lionel raised the alarm." After she'd left, Holmes sat in silence for a moment. "An intelligent woman," he observed. "Notice how she answered each question directly, without elaboration or defensiveness. Most people, when nervous, either provide too much information or too little. Miss Ravenscroft struck precisely the right balance." "You suspect her?" "I suspect everyone, Watson. It is the only scientific approach." Professor Hale proved to be a more voluble subject. He settled into the chair, with evident eagerness, as though relishing the opportunity to contribute to the investigation. "A terrible business, Mr. Holmes. Simply terrible. That such a treasure should be stolen while under this roof is almost unbearable to contemplate." "You're here to study such treasures, I understand?" Holmes inquired. "Indeed, indeed. My monograph on 13th century psalters has been in preparation for 3 years. The Codex Ravenscroft represents a crucial example of the genre, and Sir Lionel was generous enough to grant me access." "You examined it frequently during your visit?" "As often as Sir Lionel permitted. He was most accommodating, opening the cabinet for me on several occasions. I made detailed notes and sketches." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Professor, what is your estimation of the manuscript's value?" Hale's eyes lit up. "In scholarly terms, it is priceless. To a collector, however, I should estimate it might fetch £20,000, perhaps more, at auction." "A considerable sum." "Indeed. There are collectors who would pay almost any price for such a work. Do you know of any such collectors?" Hale hesitated, and I saw his gaze flicker toward the window before returning to Holmes. "There are always rumours in academic circles. A private collector in Vienna has been seeking such a manuscript for years, another in New York, but these are merely whispers, you understand." "Of course," Holmes said smoothly. "Now, Professor, I must ask where you were on the night of the theft." "In my room, working on my notes. I often work late into the night. I heard nothing unusual, though my room is on the second floor above the library wing." After the Professor's departure, Holmes rose and stretched. "Did you observe, Watson, how his eyes moved to the left and upward when I asked about collectors? A classic indication that someone is accessing memory, rather than constructing a fiction. He knows more about potential buyers than he admitted." The afternoon brought Mr. Ashcombe, whose interview was brief and to the point. He accounted for his movements on the night in question, described his discovery of the muddy boot prints, and offered his opinion that the theft must have been committed by someone familiar with the house. "The timing was too precise," he explained. "Whoever took the manuscript knew exactly when to act, knew the routines of the household. This suggests an insider rather than an external intruder." "A logical conclusion," Holmes agreed. "Tell me, Mr. Ashcombe, in your capacity as steward, are you aware of Sir Lionel's financial situation?" Ashcombe's expression grew guarded. "I manage the estate's accounts, yes. Sir Lionel's affairs are in good order. No pressing debts, no recent financial difficulties. None whatsoever. The estate is profitable and well managed." Yet something in Ashcombe's tone suggested to me that this answer, while perhaps technically true, concealed more than it revealed. Mrs. Penbury arrived for her interview as the winter afternoon was fading into dusk. She was a woman of evident dignity and long service, and she answered Holmes's questions with the precision of one accustomed to household management. "I have been housekeeper at Ravenscroft Manor for 20 years, she stated. "I know every room, every passage, every door and window in this house." "Then perhaps you can help me understand something that puzzles me," Holmes said. "The candles in the library, are they changed regularly?" "Once weekly, on Mondays. I attend to it myself." "And the quality of candles used in that room?" She drew herself up slightly. "We use the best quality throughout the house, Mr. Holmes. Sir Lionel would accept nothing less. Yet when I examined the library, the candles in the holders were of inferior tallow, not refined wax." Mrs. Penbury's composure slipped for just a moment. "That is impossible. I placed fresh candles there myself on Monday last, and they were certainly of good quality. Then someone replaced them between Monday and our arrival on Thursday evening." She had no answer to this, though I observed her hands tighten in her lap. Captain Harrow, when his turn came, spoke with military directness. He had served in India for 20 years, he explained, and had retired to England only 6 months prior. His friendship with Sir Lionel dated back to their school days. "I was invited to spend the winter here," he said. "Lionel knew I had nowhere particular to go, and he kindly offered me his hospitality." "These muddy boot prints Mr. Ashcombe mentioned," Holmes said. "He believes they match your boots." Harrow nodded without apparent concern. "They likely do. I went out yesterday afternoon to walk the grounds before the snow became too deep. I must have tracked mud inside without noticing. I cannot see the significance." "Perhaps there is none," Holmes replied mildly. "Tell me, Captain, during your years in India, did you develop an interest in antiquities?" "Not particularly. I am a soldier, Mr. Holmes, not a scholar." After the last interview concluded, Holmes and I took our dinner in the study rather than joining the household. Holmes sat before the fire, his eyes closed, replaying in his mind the conversations of the day. "What have you concluded?" I asked at length. "That everyone in this house is concealing something," he replied, opening his eyes. "The question is whether those concealments relate to the theft or merely to the ordinary secrets people carry." Miss Ravenscroft glanced at the clock when I mentioned Professor Hale. Mrs. Penbury became defensive about the candles. Ashcombe was evasive regarding finances, each small deception noted and filed away. But which are significant? That, my dear Watson, is what we must now determine. He pulled out his notebook and began to write rapidly, filling page after page with observations I could not decipher. The wind had risen, again outside, and the old house creaked and settled around us. Somewhere in these walls, I reflected, a thief walked freely, confident in their deception. But they had not reckoned with Sherlock Holmes, and that, I suspected, would prove their undoing. Chapter 6. Movements in the snowbound house. I awoke the next morning to find Holmes already gone from his room. A hasty inquiry of Mrs. Penbury revealed that he had been seen entering the library wing shortly after dawn, and I made my way there to find him seated at the desk with a large sheet of paper spread before him, upon which he had drawn what appeared to be a floor plan of Ravenscroft Manor. "Ah, Watson," he said without looking up, "your timing is excellent. I am in the process of reconstructing the movements of every person in this house on the night of the theft, and I require your assistance to verify certain observations." The paper before him was covered with neat annotations marking rooms, corridors, and doorways. Beside each location, he had noted times and initials that I took to represent the various members of the household. "I have spent the morning retracing everyone's stated movements," he explained, "and I have discovered several curious inconsistencies, small discrepancies in timing that individually mean nothing, but which collectively suggest a pattern of coordinated deception." He pointed to a notation near the library. "According to Mrs. Penbury, she was in the servants' corridor here at 11:30, conducting her nightly inspection of the doors and windows. She states that she saw no one and heard nothing unusual." "You doubt her account?" "Not necessarily, but consider this. Mr. Ashcombe told me yesterday that he passed through the same corridor at approximately 11:40, checking the locks as part of his own routine. Yet neither mentions encountering the other, despite describing tasks that would have placed them in the same location within a 10-minute span." Holmes drew a line connecting 2 points on his diagram. "Either one of them is misremembering the time, or they are deliberately providing accounts that create the appearance of constant surveillance when, in fact, there was a window of opportunity that went unobserved. But to what purpose? That is what we must determine. He stood and gestured for me to follow. Come, Watson. I wish to walk through the route from the library to the main staircase, timing the journey precisely. We spent the better part of an hour traversing various corridors and staircases, while Holmes consulted his pocket watch with obsessive precision. He measured distances in paces, noted the creak of particular floorboards, and tested the sight lines from different vantage points. At one juncture, he paused before a tall clock that stood in the main hallway. It was an impressive piece, its pendulum swinging with steady rhythm behind glass panels. "This clock," he said, examining it closely, "shows the correct time now, but was it correct on the night of the theft?" "Surely Sir Lionel would notice if it were not," I suggested. "Would he? A difference of 4 or 5 minutes might easily escape casual observation, particularly if the clock were subsequently corrected." Holmes opened the glass panel and peered at the mechanism within. "See here, Watson. There are fresh fingerprints on the minute hand, and the oil on the gears has been recently disturbed. Someone has adjusted this clock within the past few days." "But why would anyone do such a thing?" "To create confusion about timing," Holmes replied, closing the panel carefully. "If witnesses report hearing a crash at midnight, but the clock they consulted was running 4 minutes fast, then the actual time of the crash was 11:56. Those 4 minutes could be crucial." We returned to the study, where Holmes added this new information to his growing collection of notes. He was in the midst of cross-referencing the various accounts when Miss Ravenscroft appeared at the door. "Mr. Holmes, forgive the interruption, but I wondered if I might speak with you privately. There is something I neglected to mention yesterday, and it has been weighing upon my conscience." Holmes indicated a chair with a gesture of invitation. "Please, Miss Ravenscroft, any information you can provide may prove valuable." She settled herself with evident nervousness, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It concerns Professor Hale and myself. I fear I was not entirely forthcoming about the nature of our acquaintance. You knew the Professor before his arrival at Ravenscroft Manor. We were introduced in London last autumn at a lecture on medieval manuscripts. We corresponded briefly thereafter, though nothing came of it. When he wrote to Uncle Lionel requesting permission to study the Codex, he also wrote to me, suggesting that my influence might help secure the invitation. Did you comply with this request?" A flush coloured her cheeks. "I mentioned to Uncle Lionel that I had heard Professor Hale speak and found him most knowledgeable. I may have encouraged the invitation more than I would ordinarily have done. I thought nothing improper in it at the time, but now, with the manuscript stolen, I wonder if I was deceived." "Did Professor Hale at any point discuss the monetary value of the Codex with you?" "He did mention that such manuscripts were highly sought after by collectors, but he spoke in purely academic terms. I had no sense that his interest was anything other than scholarly." Holmes considered her carefully. "This correspondence between you and the Professor, do you still possess the letters?" "I do. Would you like to see them?" "If you would be so kind." She departed to fetch them, and Holmes turned to me with raised eyebrows. "An interesting development, Watson. The question is whether Miss Ravenscroft is a willing accomplice, attempting to distance herself from suspicion, or an innocent dupe who has only now realised she was being manipulated." The letters, when produced, proved to be brief and cordial, discussing scholarly matters with no obvious undercurrent of conspiracy. Yet Holmes read them with great attention, occasionally holding a page up to the light to examine the paper. "German manufacture," he murmured, indicating the watermark. "Expensive stationery for an academic whose financial circumstances are presumably modest. Interesting." The afternoon brought another revelation. I was crossing the entrance hall when I encountered Captain Harrow descending the main staircase with unusual haste. His normally composed features were troubled, and he appeared relieved to see me. "Dr. Watson, might I prevail upon you to fetch Mr. Holmes? I have discovered something in my room that I believe he should see immediately." I found Holmes in the library, and we returned together to Harrow's chamber on the second floor. The captain gestured toward his wardrobe, which stood open. "I have been organising my belongings," he explained, "preparing for eventual departure once the road's clear. Hidden at the back of the wardrobe behind my travelling cases, I found this." He indicated a small canvas bag, carefully tied with cord. Holmes lifted it with evident interest and loosened the ties. Inside were several items wrapped in cloth, a chisel, a small pry bar, and what appeared to be a glass cutter. "Housebreaking tools," Holmes observed quietly. "How long have these been in your wardrobe, Captain?" "I have no idea. They were certainly not placed there by me. I am not in the habit of burglary, Mr. Holmes." "Yet they were concealed among your possessions, where they would inevitably be discovered should the room be searched." Holmes examined each tool with his glass. "These implements are quite new, recently purchased. There is no rust, no wear from use. They appear to have been acquired specifically for this purpose and then hidden, here to implicate you." Harrow's relief was palpable. "Then you believe me?" "I believe these tools were planted in your room, yes. Whether by someone who genuinely wished to implicate you, or by someone who knew they would be found and dismissed as obvious fabrication, remains to be determined." After we had left the captain's room, securing the tools as evidence, Holmes was silent for some time. We had nearly reached the ground floor when he stopped abruptly on the stairs. "Watson, I have been approaching this case incorrectly. I have been attempting to discover who had opportunity to commit the theft, when I should have been asking who had opportunity to create the appearance of the theft. I do not follow you, Holmes. Consider what we know. The manuscript disappeared from a locked room while I was guarding the door. Impossible. A ladder was positioned to suggest someone climbed it, yet the dust beneath proves it was never used. A deliberate deception. Tools are planted to implicate Captain Harrow, yet they are so obviously planted that they serve only to exonerate him. Another deception." He began to pace along the landing, his voice growing more animated. "Someone is constructing an elaborate theatre of misdirection, layer upon layer of false evidence. But why? If you wished simply to steal the manuscript, you would do so quietly, perhaps substituting a forgery to delay discovery. You would not create an impossible locked room mystery, complete with staged props and planted evidence." "Unless the mystery itself serves a purpose," I ventured. "Precisely, Watson. The question is, what purpose? To delay discovery, to misdirect suspicion, or to conceal something else entirely?" He paused at the window, looking out at the snow-covered grounds. "There is a pattern here, a logic I have not yet grasped. But I shall grasp it. I promise you that." That evening at dinner I observed the assembled household with fresh eyes, noting the small interactions Holmes had trained me to recognise. Mrs. Penbury and Mr. Ashcombe exchanged a brief glance when Sir Lionel mentioned the possibility of the roads clearing by week's end. Miss Ravenscroft appeared distracted, barely touching her food. Professor Hale maintained an almost excessive cheerfulness that seemed forced. After the meal, Holmes drew me aside into the relative privacy of the conservatory. "I shall require your assistance tonight, Watson. Bring your service revolver and meet me in the library at 11:30. I believe our thief may make another move, and I intend to be ready." "You expect another theft?" "I expect a revelation," he replied cryptically. "The pieces are almost in place, Watson. Almost, but not quite. Tonight, I believe, will provide the final elements I require." The hours until our appointment passed with agonizing slowness. I retired to my room and attempted to read, but found concentration impossible. My mind kept returning to the various clues and contradictions Holmes had uncovered. The adjusted clock, the planted tools, the replaced candles, the coordinated movements in the corridor. Each element suggested careful planning, yet to what end? At precisely 11:30, I made my way through the darkened house to the library, my revolver secure in my pocket. Holmes was already there, seated in darkness near the window, barely visible in the faint moonlight that penetrated the clouds. "Excellent, Watson," he whispered as I entered. "Now we wait and watch." Someone in this house is not yet finished with their performance, and when they make their next move, we shall be ready. I took up position near the door, my heart beating faster with anticipation. Whatever was to happen, I sensed we stood on the threshold of revelation. The midnight hour approached, and with it, I hoped, the truth. Chapter 7. The Hidden Manuscript. The midnight hour came and went without incident. Holmes remained motionless by the window, his attention fixed upon the darkness beyond while I stood guard at the door. The house slept around us, silent save for the occasional groan of settling timbers and the whisper of wind against the ancient walls. It was nearing 2 o'clock when Holmes finally stirred. "Nothing," he said quietly. "Either our quarry has grown cautious, or tonight was not the night I anticipated. Come, Watson. We have learned what we can from watching. Tomorrow we must try a different approach." We made our way through the corridors toward our rooms, but as we passed the main staircase, a sound arrested our progress. It was faint, coming from somewhere above us, a sort of muffled thump followed by what might have been hurried footsteps. Holmes's hand shot out to grip my arm. Without a word, we ascended the stairs as silently as possible, pausing on the landing to determine the source of the disturbance. The sounds appeared to have come from the direction of the guest chambers. As we proceeded down the corridor, a door opened suddenly and Professor Hale emerged, a candle in his hand and his nightshirt hastily covered by a dressing gown. He started violently at the sight of us. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you gave me quite a fright. I heard sounds from below and came to investigate." "Curious," Holmes remarked mildly. "We heard sounds from above and are engaged in the same pursuit. Tell me, Professor, what precisely did you hear?" Hale appeared flustered. "I cannot be certain. A crash, perhaps, or the closing of a heavy door. Living in college rooms, one becomes attuned to such disturbances. I thought perhaps someone was ill and required assistance." "Most considerate. And you saw no one as you emerged from your room?" "No one at all." Holmes thanked him and we continued our patrol, checking each corridor and finding nothing amiss. Yet I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong, that Professor Hale's explanation had been too ready, too smooth. When we finally retired, Holmes sat upon the edge of my bed and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow, Watson, I shall request that Sir Lionel permit us to conduct a thorough search of the house. Someone has hidden that manuscript somewhere within these walls, and I mean to find it." Morning brought leaden skies and the threat of fresh snow. At breakfast, Holmes made his request to Sir Lionel, who agreed with weary resignation. "Do whatever you deem necessary, Mr. Holmes. I have lost faith in my own judgment. The manuscript is gone, my household is in turmoil, and I begin to wonder if I shall ever see order restored." Holmes organised the search with military precision. He assigned Mr. Ashcombe to examine the servants' quarters and outbuildings, while Captain Harrow was tasked with searching the cellars and storage rooms. Miss Ravenscroft would accompany Mrs. Penbury in inspecting the less frequented chambers of the house. Holmes himself, with my assistance, would examine the guest rooms and private quarters. We began with the rooms currently unoccupied, moving methodically from one to another, checking wardrobes, examining floorboards, probing chimneys, and testing wall panels for signs of concealment. It was tedious work, but Holmes approached it with characteristic thoroughness. It was mid-afternoon when we arrived at Professor Hale's chamber. The professor had been summoned to join the search elsewhere, and his room stood empty. It was a comfortable space, well appointed and warmed by a small fire. His travelling trunk occupied one corner, and various books and papers were arranged neatly upon the desk. Holmes began with the desk, examining each paper with care. The professor's notes were extensive and detailed, filled with sketches of manuscript illuminations and scholarly observations. Nothing appeared suspicious. The wardrobe yielded only clothing and personal effects. The bed and its surroundings revealed nothing of interest. Holmes was in the process of examining the windowsill when I decided to investigate the travelling trunk. It was locked, but the mechanism was simple, and I had learned a thing or two about such devices during my association with Holmes. Within moments, I had it open. The trunk contained clothing, toiletries, and more books. I was about to close it when something caught my eye. The interior depth of the trunk did not match its exterior dimensions. There appeared to be a false bottom. "Holmes," I called quietly. He was at my side in an instant. Together we removed the trunk's contents and examined the base. Holmes's nimble fingers found a catch concealed beneath the lining, and a section of the bottom lifted free. Beneath it, wrapped in oiled cloth and nestled in protective padding, lay the Codex Ravenscroft. For a moment, we simply stared at it, scarcely believing what we'd found. The manuscript appeared undamaged, its illuminated pages as beautiful as they had been in the glass cabinet. Holmes lifted it, carefully, examining it in the light from the window. "Extraordinary," he murmured, "hidden in the most obvious place imaginable." "We must inform Sir Lionel at once," I said. "Indeed we must. Though I confess, Watson, this discovery raises as many questions as it answers." We found Sir Lionel in his study and presented him with the recovered manuscript. His joy was profound and immediate, tears streaming down his aged face as he cradled the treasure in his hands. "Thank God," he whispered. "Thank God, and thank you, Mr. Holmes. I had almost given up hope." "The question now," Holmes said gently, "is how to proceed. Professor Hale must be confronted with this evidence, and his explanation obtained." Sir Lionel's expression hardened. "Send for him at once. I would hear what that scoundrel has to say for himself." Professor Hale was located in the library wing, still engaged in the search that Holmes had organised. When he was brought to the study and saw the manuscript restored, to Sir Lionel's possession, all colour drained from his face. "I can explain," he began, but Sir Lionel cut him off with a gesture. "You will explain to Mr. Holmes and to the authorities. I want nothing from you but your departure from my house, and that must wait until the roads are clear." Holmes indicated a chair. "Please sit, Professor. I believe you have a great deal to tell us." Hale sank into the chair. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. He appeared to age 10 years in as many seconds. "I have been a fool," he said quietly. "A vain, ambitious fool." "You stole the manuscript," Holmes prompted. "I did. Not for money, Mr. Holmes. You must believe me on that point. My interest was purely scholarly. The Codex contains certain textual variations that are crucial to my research, variations that cannot be adequately studied through brief examinations. I needed time with it, days or weeks, not the few hours Sir Lionel could spare. So you conceived a plan to steal it?" Hale nodded miserably. "I obtained a key to the cabinet through means I am ashamed to describe. I had planned simply to borrow the manuscript for a few days, make my studies, and return it before its absence was noticed. But then Sir Lionel mentioned he had invited you, Mr. Holmes, and I panicked. I knew you would discover the truth, so I decided to hide the manuscript in my room and claim ignorance. I thought if it were found there, I could express shock and suggest it had been planted to implicate me." "A thin deception," Holmes observed. "I know. I was desperate. I convinced myself it might work." He looked up at Holmes with something approaching pleading in his eyes. "I never intended to keep it permanently. I am not a thief by nature, merely a scholar who let ambition overcome judgment." Holmes exchanged a glance with me, and I saw in his expression something I could not quite interpret. Was it satisfaction at having solved the case, or was it something else? Some reservation I could not identify? "Your confession is noted," Holmes said at length. "Sir Lionel, I recommend Professor Hale be confined to his room until such time as the authorities can be summoned. Given the value of what was stolen, this is a matter for the police." "Agreed," Sir Lionel said firmly. "Captain Harrow, would you be good enough to escort the Professor to his chamber and ensure he remains there?" Harrow, who had been summoned to witness the confrontation, nodded grimly. "With pleasure." As Hale was led away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Sir Lionel turned to Holmes with profound gratitude. "You have performed a miracle, Mr. Holmes. The manuscript is recovered, the thief identified and caught. I can never adequately express my thanks." "Your thanks are premature," Holmes replied quietly. "The manuscript is recovered, true, but I'm not entirely convinced we have caught the thief." Sir Lionel stared at him in bewilderment. "But the Professor confessed. The manuscript was in his trunk." "So it was, yet certain elements of this affair continue to trouble me." Holmes moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "I should like to retain Professor Hale here at Ravenscroft for another day or two, before notifying the authorities. With your permission, of course." "But why? The matter is resolved." "Is it?" Holmes turned to face us, and I saw in his eyes that peculiar gleam that indicated his mind was working at full capacity. "Professor Hale's confession explains the disappearance of the manuscript, but it does not explain the midnight sounds, the staged ladder, the planted tools in Captain Harrow's wardrobe, or the adjusted clock in the hallway. It does not explain why candles were replaced, or why there is fresh soot near a sealed chimney." "Perhaps those details are unrelated," I suggested, though even as I spoke the words I doubted them. "I think not, Watson. I think they are very much related, but not in the way we have been led to believe." He turned back to Sir Lionel. "Indulge me for 2 more days. Keep the Professor confined by all means, but delay contacting the police. I wish to conduct one more experiment, and for that I require everyone to remain exactly where they are." Sir Lionel agreed, though with evident reluctance. As we left the study, I pulled Holmes aside. "You don't believe the Professor is guilty?" "Oh, I believe he is guilty of something, Watson. But whether that something is theft or merely spectacular foolishness remains to be determined. A man does not create an elaborate locked-room mystery, complete with theatrical props and false clues, simply to buy himself a few extra days of study. There is more to this affair than Professor Hale's confession suggests." "Then what do you intend to do?" Holmes smiled, but there was no humour in it. "I intend to set a trap, my dear fellow, and before tomorrow night is through, I shall know whether we have caught a thief or merely a scapegoat." The confidence in his voice was reassuring, yet I could not help but feel we stood upon uncertain ground. The manuscript was recovered, the culprit had confessed, and yet Holmes insisted the case remained unsolved. It was, I reflected with some unease, a most peculiar state of affairs. Chapter 8. Confidence in the wrong solution. The household that evening was pervaded by a curious atmosphere of relief mingled with lingering unease. The manuscript had been recovered, the thief identified and confined to his quarters under Captain Harrow's watchful eye. Yet Holmes's insistence that the matter remained unresolved had cast a shadow over what should have been a celebration. I found him after dinner in the library, the very scene of the supposed crime, conducting yet another minute examination of the room. He had brought several candles and was subjecting the sealed fireplace to particularly intense scrutiny. "You truly believe Professor Hale is innocent?" I asked, settling into the chair at the desk. "I believe Professor Hale is guilty of taking the manuscript," Holmes replied without looking up from his work. "What I do not believe is that he orchestrated this entire elaborate charade. The man we interviewed yesterday, the man who confessed this afternoon, lacks the imagination and nerve required for such a performance." He produced his penknife and began carefully scraping at the mortar around the iron plate that sealed the fireplace. Small fragments of grey powder fell to the floor, which he collected on a piece of paper and examined closely. "Fresh mortar," he murmured. "Applied within the past month, I should estimate. Yet Sir Lionel assured us this fireplace was sealed 30 years ago. Could not repairs have been made without his knowledge? To what purpose? The chimney was described as dangerously cracked and filled with rubble. What would be the point of fresh mortar?" He stood and brushed the dust from his hands. "No, Watson. Someone has been working at this fireplace recently, and they have taken care to conceal that work." He moved to the desk and began examining it afresh, running his fingers along the underside of the writing surface and inspecting the joints where the legs met the frame. His attention was arrested by something, and he bent closer with his glass. "Watson, bring one of those candles here." I complied, holding the light where he directed. In its glow, I could see faint marks on the floorboards beneath the desk, parallel lines worn into the wood. "These boards have been walked upon repeatedly," Holmes observed. "See how the wear pattern extends from the desk toward the fireplace. Someone has paced this route many times, far more often than would be explained by Sir Lionel's occasional use of the room. Perhaps the servants, during cleaning? The dust accumulation suggests the room is cleaned infrequently at best. No, these marks are recent and deliberate. Someone has spent considerable time in this library over the past few weeks, and I do not believe it was Sir Lionel." He stood abruptly and turned to face me. "Tomorrow morning, I intend to request a reenactment of the night of the theft. I shall ask each member of the household to retrace their movements from that evening, performing the same actions they claim to have performed at the same times. I have found that such exercises often reveal discrepancies that questioning alone cannot uncover. You believe someone will betray themselves? I believe the truth has a way of asserting itself when subjected to practical testing." He glanced toward the window, where darkness had fallen complete. "For now, however, I suggest we retire. Tomorrow promises to be illuminating." The following morning, Holmes assembled the household in the entrance hall and explained his intention. There was some reluctance, particularly from Mrs. Penbury, who protested that she had duties to attend to, but Sir Lionel's authority prevailed and all agreed to participate. Holmes had obtained Sir Lionel's permission to release Professor Hale from confinement for the exercise, though Captain Harrow was instructed to remain close to him. The professor appeared haggard and defeated, his earlier scholarly enthusiasm entirely extinguished. "We shall begin at 11 o'clock, Holmes announced, consulting his pocket watch, "which corresponds to 1 hour before the supposed time of the theft. Each of you will position yourself where you claim to have been at that hour, and then proceed through your evening activities exactly as you describe them to me. I shall observe, and Dr. Watson will record the sequence of movements." I had brought my notebook for this purpose, and stood ready to chronicle the proceedings. Holmes had positioned himself at the junction of several corridors, from which vantage point he could observe multiple routes simultaneously. The exercise began with a degree of self-consciousness among the participants. Sir Lionel retired to his study, where he claimed to have been working on correspondence. Miss Ravenscroft went to the drawing-room with a book. Professor Hale positioned himself in his chamber, as he had been at the relevant time. Mrs. Penbury began her rounds of the ground floor, checking windows and doors. Mr. Ashcombe took up station in his office near the servants' quarters. Captain Harrow, who had been in the billiard-room that evening, moved to that location. Holmes's watch marked the passing of each quarter hour, and he called out the time so that all might synchronize their movements. It was at 11:45 that he signalled for the critical sequence to begin. "Mrs. Penbury," he called, "you stated you were in the servants' corridor at this time. Please proceed there now." The housekeeper moved through the house with practised efficiency, arriving at the designated corridor and pausing there as she claimed to have done. "Mr. Ashcombe, you stated you passed through the same corridor at approximately 11:40. Please demonstrate." Ashcombe emerged from his office and made his way toward the corridor. As he approached, it became apparent that his route would bring him directly past Mrs. Penbury. Yet according to their original accounts, neither had mentioned encountering the other. Holmes watched intently as Ashcombe, realizing the discrepancy, slowed his pace. He glanced at Mrs. Penbury, who had gone quite pale. "Curious," Holmes observed mildly. "It appears you would have met one another. Can you explain why neither of you mentioned this in your original accounts?" There was a moment of charged silence. Mrs. Penbury spoke first, her voice tight with strain. "I must have been mistaken about the time. Perhaps I was there earlier than I thought." "Or perhaps," Holmes suggested gently, "you were not there at all." He allowed this observation to settle before continuing the exercise. At the stroke of 12 on his watch, he directed everyone to freeze in their positions. "This is the moment when the crash was supposedly heard. Miss Ravenscroft, where were you?" "In my room," she replied from above. "I heard nothing." "Captain Harrow?" "In the billiard-room. I heard what might have been a distant sound, but thought nothing of it." "Professor Hale?" "In my chamber," the professor said quietly. "I heard nothing at all." Holmes made several notes, then directed everyone to the library. When we had assembled there, he positioned himself before the sealed fireplace and addressed the group. I have observed several interesting facts during this exercise. First, the timing of movements in the servants' corridor is irreconcilable with the accounts given. Second, not everyone who claims to have heard the midnight crash could have done so from their stated positions, given the thickness of walls and distance involved. Third, and most significantly, I have confirmed my suspicion about this room. He turned and tapped the iron plate with his knuckles. The sound was hollow, resonant. This fireplace, he announced, is not sealed at all. Or rather, it was not sealed until very recently. The mortar around this plate is fresh, applied within the past few days. Behind it, I believe we will find not a blocked chimney filled with rubble, but a passage of some kind. Sir Lionel stepped forward, his face reflecting profound shock. That is impossible. I was present when my father had the chimney filled. I saw the work done myself. Then either your memory deceives you, or the work was subsequently undone and recently redone to conceal the fact. Holmes turned to Mr. Ashcombe. You would have overseen such work, would you not? Any repairs or alterations to the house would fall under your purview as steward. Ashcombe's capable features had set into an expression of wary neutrality. No such work was authorised by me, Mr. Holmes. Yet it was done nonetheless. Holmes's eyes swept across the assembled faces. Someone in this room knows how to open this passage, and someone in this room has been using it regularly. The wear pattern on the floor, the disturbed dust, the fresh soot, all point to recent and repeated access. He paused, allowing the tension to build. I propose we remove this iron plate and see what lies behind it. I suspect we shall find our answers there. Sir Lionel gave his consent immediately, and Mr. Ashcombe was dispatched to fetch the necessary tools. The wait for his return seemed interminable, the assembled household standing in strained silence. When Ashcombe returned with a crowbar and hammer, Holmes directed him to pry loose the iron plate. The steward hesitated for a fraction of a second, then set to work. The mortar proved to be indeed fresh, crumbling easily under his efforts. Within minutes, the plate came free with a scraping sound. Behind it, just as Holmes had predicted, was not a blocked chimney but a narrow opening, perhaps 2 feet square. Holmes struck a match and peered inside. A passage, he confirmed, leading downward at an angle, built into the original structure of the house, I should imagine, though concealed and forgotten until someone rediscovered it. He turned to face us all, and in his expression I saw the satisfaction of a man whose theories had been vindicated. This, he declared, is how the manuscript was removed from the library while I stood guard at the door. This is how the midnight sounds were created. This is the mechanism by which an impossible crime was made to appear impossible by design rather than by accident. Mrs. Penbury had sunk into a chair, her face ashen. Mr. Ashcombe stood frozen, the crowbar still in his hands. It was clear to me that Holmes had struck close to the truth, though what that truth entailed in its entirety I could not yet discern. I believe, Holmes continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, that it is time for complete honesty. Mrs. Penbury, Mr. Ashcombe, I suggest you tell Sir Lionel the truth before I am forced to reveal it myself. A confession now may mitigate what is to come. The housekeeper and the steward exchanged a long look, and in that moment I saw the truth of Holmes's deduction written plainly across their features. The performance was over. The real story was about to begin. Chapter 9. Holmes reveals the truth. The silence that followed Holmes's pronouncement was profound. Mrs. Penbury sat rigid in her chair, her hands gripping the armrests with such force that her knuckles had gone white. Mr. Ashcombe remained standing, the crowbar lowering slowly to his side, as though its weight had suddenly become unbearable. It was Sir Lionel who broke the silence, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and bewilderment. Mrs. Penbury, I have employed you for 20 years, Mr. Ashcombe 15. If you have betrayed my trust, I demand to know why." The housekeeper's composure crumbled. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Ashcombe crossed to her side and placed a hand upon her shoulder, a gesture that spoke of long familiarity and deep affection. "It was my fault," he said quietly, addressing Sir Lionel. "All of it. Mrs. Penbury acted only out of loyalty to me, and that loyalty has brought her to ruin." Holmes had moved to the desk and seated himself, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose I knew so well. "Perhaps," he suggested gently, "you should begin at the beginning, Mr. Ashcombe. I can reconstruct the facts from evidence, but only you can provide the motivations that drove you to such desperate measures." Ashcombe drew a deep breath and seemed to gather himself. When he spoke, his voice was steady despite the obvious distress beneath. "I am not by nature a dishonest man, Mr. Holmes. For 15 years I have managed this estate with scrupulous care, never taking so much as a shilling that was not rightfully mine. But 18 months ago my sister fell gravely ill. The physicians offered hope, but only if she could travel to Switzerland for treatment at a particular sanatorium. The cost was beyond anything I could raise through legitimate means." "You required a substantial sum," Holmes observed. £5,000. I applied to banks, to money-lenders, to everyone I could think of. But I am a man of modest means and no property of my own. No one would lend me such an amount." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "My sister died 6 months ago. Before I could secure the funds, I was consumed with guilt, with the conviction that I had failed her." "And you turned to the Codex Ravenscroft," Holmes said quietly. Ashcombe nodded. "I knew its value. Over the years, Sir Lionel had occasionally mentioned offers from collectors, sums that would have easily covered my sister's treatment 10 times over. The temptation grew overwhelming, I told myself. I would arrange to sell it and that Sir Lionel need never know it was gone. I would create confusion, make it appear that multiple parties might have taken it, and by the time the truth emerged, if it ever did, I would be far away." Mrs. Penbury had raised her head and now spoke, her voice hoarse with emotion. "I discovered what Victor intended quite by accident. I found him one night examining the old house plans in the estate office. When I pressed him, he confessed everything. His sister, his debts, his desperation. I could not let him destroy himself alone." "So you became his accomplice," Holmes said, though there was no judgment in his tone. "I did more than that. I helped him plan it all." She looked at Sir Lionel with profound remorse. "I have served you faithfully for 20 years, and this is how I repay that kindness. I shall never forgive myself." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about the passage behind the fireplace." Ashcombe seemed almost relieved to turn to practical matters. "I found reference to it in the old estate records. When this portion of the house was built in the 15th century, it included several concealed passages meant as escape routes during times of danger. Most were sealed long ago, but this one, connecting the library to the old servants' quarters below, remained intact. The fireplace was added later, and when Sir Lionel's father had it sealed, he was unaware of the passage behind it." "You reopened it," Holmes stated. "I did. I carefully removed the iron plate and chipped away the old mortar and masonry. The passage beyond was clear and usable. I tested it several times over the course of weeks, familiarizing myself with its length and characteristics." "And the midnight sounds?" I interjected, unable to contain my curiosity. "My doing," Ashcombe admitted. "I created them deliberately to establish a pattern of supernatural disturbance. I would enter through the passage late at night, make just enough noise to be heard, then depart before anyone could investigate. I wanted Sir Lionel to become accustomed to the idea that the library was being visited by something inexplicable." Holmes nodded slowly. "A clever piece of psychological preparation. When the manuscript finally disappeared, it would seem the culmination of an ongoing mystery rather than an isolated theft, and Professor Hale's arrival provided you with an unexpected opportunity." "It did," Ashcombe said with evident shame. I learned through Miss Ravenscroft that the Professor had corresponded with her before his arrival, that he had a particular interest in the Codex. When Mr. Holmes was invited to investigate the disturbances, I realised my original plan would no longer work. You would uncover the truth too quickly. So you adapted, Holmes said. You decided to frame Professor Hale. Not frame exactly, Mrs. Penbury interjected. We learned that the Professor had obtained a duplicate key to the manuscript cabinet, through means we need not detail. He had examined the Codex several times without Sir Lionel's knowledge, purely for his scholarly work. When we discovered this, we realised he had already made himself vulnerable to suspicion. Holmes's eyes gleamed with understanding. So you removed the manuscript before Watson and I ever arrived at Ravenscroft Manor. The cabinet we examined on our first night here contained not the genuine Codex, but a forgery, hastily created or perhaps a blank manuscript, wrapped to approximate the correct size and appearance. A blank manuscript, Ashcombe confirmed. In poor light through glass, it would pass casual inspection. We gambled that you would not ask to examine it closely before beginning your vigil. A gamble that succeeded, Holmes acknowledged. Continue. While you stood guard at the door that night, Mrs. Penbury and I worked together. I entered the library through the passage, removed the false manuscript from the cabinet using the duplicate key we had obtained, staged the fallen ladder and candlestick to create evidence of disturbance, then returned through the passage. The real Codex was already hidden in Professor Hale's trunk, placed there earlier that evening while he was at dinner. The timing of your movements in the servants' corridor, Holmes said, was coordinated to create the impression of constant surveillance, when in fact you were providing each other with alibis while leaving the critical moments unobserved. Precisely, Mrs. Penbury admitted. We knew you would interview us, that you would attempt to verify our movements. We created accounts that seemed to corroborate each other, while concealing the gaps we had exploited. Holmes rose and began to pace slowly before the fireplace. The adjusted clock, the planted tools in Captain Harrow's wardrobe, the loosened window latch, all were designed to create confusion and misdirection. You wanted me to believe multiple people might be involved, that the theft was more complex than it actually was. We wanted to buy time, Ashcombe said. Time for the roads to clear, time for us to depart before the full truth emerged. We thought if Professor Hale were caught with the manuscript, his confession would satisfy everyone and the investigation would cease. And it very nearly did, Holmes observed. Professor Hale's scholarly obsession made him the perfect scapegoat. His confession was genuine as far as it went. He did obtain a duplicate key, he did examine the manuscript without permission, and he did intend to study it at length. But he never actually stole it from the cabinet. You simply placed it in his possession and waited for it to be discovered. Sir Lionel had been listening to this recitation with an expression of profound dismay. Now he spoke, his voice heavy with sorrow. What did you intend to do with the manuscript once Professor Hale had been arrested for its theft? Ashcombe met his employer's eyes directly. I had made contact with a collector in Vienna through intermediaries. Once the initial furor had died down and Professor Hale had been taken into custody, I intended to claim that I had recovered the manuscript from where he had hidden it before the search. I would return it to you with great ceremony, restoring your faith in me. Then, months later, I would substitute a forgery and sell the genuine article. By the time the deception was discovered, if it ever was, I would be beyond reach. It was an elaborate plan, Holmes said, but it contained fatal flaws. You underestimated how thoroughly I would examine the library. The fresh mortar, the disturbed dust patterns, the wear on the floorboards, all pointed to recent and repeated access through means other than the door. The candle replacement was another error. You could not use the same quality candles for your midnight performances as were normally present in the room, lest the wax be compared and the deception revealed. But in replacing them, you created evidence of substitution. I knew we had made mistakes, Mrs. Penbury said quietly. As the investigation progressed, I became increasingly certain you had seen through our deceptions. But by then, it was too late to withdraw. We could only continue and hope. Holmes returned to his chair and regarded the pair with an expression that held more sadness than triumph. Your loyalty to each other is evident and in its way admirable, but you have committed serious crimes. The attempted theft of an object worth thousands of pounds, the conspiracy to implicate an innocent man in that theft, the betrayal of trust that had been freely given. He turned to Sir Lionel. The decision of how to proceed must be yours. You are the aggrieved party, and both criminal law and natural justice grant you the right to determine their fate. Sir Lionel sat in silence for a long moment, his aged features working through a succession of emotions. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm despite the evident pain it cost him. Mrs. Penbury, Mr. Ashcombe, you have served this house for many years. That service until now has been beyond reproach. I am inclined toward mercy, but I cannot simply overlook what has occurred. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I will not summon the police. The scandal would serve no one and would destroy Professor Hale, who is guilty of nothing more than scholarly excess. But neither can you remain in my employ. You will depart Ravenscroft Manor as soon as the roads are clear, and you will not return. I will provide you with references that acknowledge your years of service, without mention of this incident, but our association ends here. The relief on both faces was palpable. Mrs. Penbury rose unsteadily and attempted to speak, but Sir Lionel raised a hand. No more words. The matter is concluded. Holmes nodded his approval. A just and merciful resolution. However, there remains the matter of Professor Hale. He sits, confined in his room, believing himself guilty of a theft he did not actually commit. He must be informed of the truth. I shall speak with him myself, Sir Lionel said. The poor man deserves to know he has been manipulated. As the assembled company dispersed, each person burdened with their own reflections on what had transpired, Holmes and I remained in the library. He stood before the open passage, peering into its darkness with professional interest. An ingenious piece of construction, he remarked, and an equally ingenious piece of deception built upon it. In their way, Ashcombe and Mrs. Penbury demonstrated considerable skill. Yet you saw through it all, I observed. Eventually, Watson, eventually. But I confess they led me a merry dance before the truth revealed itself. He turned from the passage with a slight smile. It is a reminder that the most elaborate deceptions often conceal the simplest of motives. Greed, certainly, but also love and loyalty and desperation. Very human failings, all of them. What will become of them, do you think? That depends entirely upon whether they have learned from this experience. Ashcombe's sister is beyond saving, but perhaps this ordeal will teach him that some prices are too high to pay, even for those we love. He glanced around the library one final time, then gestured toward the door. Come, Watson, our work here is done. Tomorrow the roads will be clear, and we can return to London with this curious case added to our chronicles. As we left the library, I reflected on all that had transpired. A priceless manuscript stolen and recovered, an innocent man nearly destroyed, and 2 loyal servants brought to ruin by desperation and misplaced devotion. It was, I thought, a most instructive demonstration of how even the most impossible of crimes could be rendered perfectly explicable by the application of reason and observation. And that, after all, was the peculiar genius of Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 10. Order Restored. The following morning dawned bright and clear, the first truly fine day since our arrival at Ravenscroft Manor. The storm had passed, leaving the landscape transformed into something pristine and beautiful, beneath fresh snow that sparkled in the sunlight. From my bedroom window I could see the main road where gangs of labourers were already at work clearing the drifts, their distant figures moving with purposeful energy. I found Holmes at breakfast, engaged in conversation with Sir Lionel. The elderly scholar appeared to have aged considerably over the past few days, the lines around his eyes deeper, his movements slower. Yet there was also a kind of relief in his bearing, as though the resolution of uncertainty, however painful, was preferable to continued doubt. The roads should be passable by tomorrow, Sir Lionel was saying as I joined them. I have arranged for a carriage to take Mrs. Penbury and Mr. Ashcombe to the railway station. They departed their rooms at first light and are making preparations to leave. And Professor Hale? Holmes inquired. I spoke with him at length last evening. The poor man was devastated to learn he had been so manipulated, but also profoundly relieved to know he was not guilty of actual theft. He departed before dawn, walking to the village despite the snow. I suspect he was eager to be away from this place and all its associations. "Oh, understandable sentiment," Holmes observed. "He's been through a considerable ordeal, albeit partly of his own making. His obsession with the Codex, while not criminal, provided the opening through which Ashcombe and Mrs. Penbury nearly achieved their aims." After breakfast, Holmes suggested we take a final walk through the grounds before our own departure. We wrapped ourselves against the cold and ventured out into the brilliant morning. The air was sharp and clean, and our breath formed clouds as we made our way along paths that had been cleared by the house staff. "You're satisfied with the resolution?" I asked as we walked. Holmes considered the question carefully. "Satisfied is perhaps too strong a word. The case is solved, the manuscript recovered, and justice has been served after a fashion. Yet I cannot help but feel a certain melancholy. Ashcombe and Mrs. Penbury were not criminals by nature. Circumstance and desperation drove them to acts they would never have contemplated under ordinary conditions. You think Sir Lionel was right not to prosecute? I think he was merciful, which is not quite the same thing as right. The law exists for good reason, and violations of it cannot be dismissed simply because the violators had understandable motives. Yet I also recognise that rigid application of law without consideration for human complexity can produce its own injustices. Sir Lionel has chosen a middle path, and I respect that choice." We had reached a point where the grounds overlooked the moorland, a vast expanse of white stretching to the horizon. Holmes stood gazing out at it, his hands clasped behind his back. "What strikes me most about this case, Watson, is how nearly it succeeded despite its inherent flaws. Had I not examined the library with particular attention to the fireplace, had I not noticed the fresh mortar and traced its implications, Ashcombe's plan might well have worked. Professor Hale would have been convicted, the manuscript eventually restored through apparent chance, and the true thieves would have remained unsuspected. But you did notice, I pointed out. You always do. This time, yes. But I am not infallible, Watson, however much you may wish to believe otherwise. I make errors, I overlook details, I allow my assumptions to mislead me. In this case, I very nearly convinced myself that the locked room was the central mystery, when in fact it was merely theatre designed to obscure a much simpler crime, yet you corrected your error. Eventually. The process was neither swift nor elegant. He turned to face me, a slight smile playing about his lips. I tell you this not to diminish your faith in my methods, my dear fellow, but to remind us both that deduction, however scientific, remains a human endeavour subject to human limitations. The truth in this case was accessible to anyone willing to observe carefully and think clearly. I simply happened to be the one who did so. We returned to the house to find a certain bustle of activity in progress. Mrs. Penbury and Mr. Ashcombe were preparing to depart, their belongings packed and waiting in the entrance hall. The housekeeper had recovered something of her dignity, though her face remained drawn and pale. Ashcombe stood beside her, his expression one of quiet resignation. Sir Lionel emerged from his study to bid them farewell. It was a painful scene, made all the more so by the evident affection that still existed between employer and servants despite the betrayal that had occurred. "I wish you well," Sir Lionel said quietly. "Truly I do. You have been good and faithful servants for many years, and I choose to remember that service rather than its ending." Mrs. Penbury attempted to speak but could not find words. She curtsied deeply, a gesture of respect that belonged to an earlier era, then turned quickly and departed before her composure could fail entirely. Ashcombe shook Sir Lionel's hand, his own grip firm despite the tremor I detected in it. "Thank you, sir," he managed, "for your mercy. I shall not forget it." Then they were gone, the sound of their carriage wheels crunching on the snow gradually fading into silence. Sir Lionel stood at the window watching until they disappeared from view, then sighed heavily and turned back to us. "It is a sad business, Mr. Holmes. To lose both a trusted housekeeper and a capable steward in one stroke will create considerable difficulties. But I suppose I must count myself fortunate that the loss was no greater." "You have your manuscript," Holmes observed. "That, surely, is what matters most." "The manuscript, yes. But also something more valuable, I think. I have learned that treasures, however precious, can become prisons if we allow them to consume our attention to the exclusion of human considerations. I nearly lost far more than a medieval psalter these past days. I nearly lost my faith in the basic decency of those around me." Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgment. "A worthy lesson, and one cheaply purchased at the price of mere anxiety and inconvenience." That afternoon, as our own preparations for departure were being completed, I found Holmes once more in the library. He had requested permission to examine the hidden passage more thoroughly, and I discovered him emerging from it, his clothes dusty and a look of satisfaction on his face. "A remarkable piece of construction," he announced, brushing himself off. "The passage descends through the walls to a small chamber beneath the servants' quarters, then exits through what appears to be a disused wine cellar, entirely invisible unless one knows precisely where to look. Medieval builders possessed considerable ingenuity when it came to creating escape routes and hiding places. Will Sir Lionel seal it again? He intends to, though this time he will ensure the work is properly documented so that future generations need not rediscover it through investigation of mysterious noises." Holmes paused, running his hand along the edge of the fireplace opening. "It is strange to think that this passage existed for centuries, forgotten and unused, until circumstance and desperation led Ashcombe to uncover it. Hidden things have a way of revealing themselves when the time is right." We departed Ravenscroft Manor the following morning, Sir Lionel accompanying us to the carriage and pressing upon us his profound thanks. Miss Ravenscroft, who had remained largely in the background during the final revelations, bade us a courteous farewell. Captain Harrow, preparing for his own departure to London, shook our hands with military firmness and expressed his admiration for Holmes's detective abilities. The journey back to London was uneventful, the trains running on schedule now that the weather had cleared. Holmes spent much of the trip in contemplative silence, occasionally making notes in his pocketbook, but generally seeming content to watch the countryside slide past our window. It was only as we approached the familiar environs of the capital that he spoke at length. "You will write this case up for your chronicles, I presume?" "If you have no objection," I replied. "It seems to me a perfect demonstration of your methods. Write it as you see fit, Watson, but perhaps emphasise not merely the solution but the manner in which the crime was constructed. Ashcombe and Mrs. Penbury created a masterpiece of misdirection, and even though it ultimately failed, the architecture of their deception deserves acknowledgement. They understood that the best way to conceal a simple theft was to make it appear impossibly complex. The locked room that was never truly locked. Precisely. The door was secured, certainly, but the room itself was as accessible as any chamber in the house to those who knew of the passage. Yet by staging the theft to emphasise the impossible, they nearly convinced everyone, myself included, to look in the wrong direction for the solution." He fell silent again, and I thought he'd finished. But as we pulled into the station, he added one more observation. "Remember this case, Watson, when next you encounter a mystery that appears to defy rational explanation. The most impossible crimes are often the most mundane once their mechanisms are understood. It is not the brilliance of the criminal that creates impossibility, but the limitations of the observer's perspective. Change the perspective, and the impossible becomes merely unlikely. Change it again, and the unlikely becomes obvious." We returned to Baker Street to find Mrs. Hudson delighted to see us safely home. The familiar rooms welcomed us with their comfortable clutter, the chemistry apparatus on the table, the violin case by the chair, the Persian slipper containing Holmes's tobacco, After the gothic atmosphere of Ravenscroft Manor, these prosaic surroundings seemed almost absurdly normal. Yet, as I settled into my chair by the fire that evening, my notes spread before me as I began to organise my thoughts for this narrative. I reflected that it was precisely in such normality that Holmes's genius showed most clearly. He had taken a mystery wrapped in suggestion of the supernatural, stripped away its theatrical trappings, and revealed the human drama beneath. No ghosts haunted the Midnight Library, no curses protected the ancient manuscript. There was only desperation and loyalty, cleverness and error, and ultimately the inevitable triumph of careful observation over elaborate deception. I wrote late into the night, capturing the details while they remained fresh in my memory. When I finally set down my pen, I glanced across at Holmes and found him watching me with amusement. "The Secret of the Midnight Library," he suggested. "You read my thoughts." "I read your notes, Watson. The title is clearly visible from here, written in that large hand you employ when beginning a new case history." I smiled despite myself. It seems appropriate. The library was the heart of the mystery and midnight the hour of its supposed haunting. Then by all means let that be the title. He reached for his violin. "And now, if you will excuse me, I believe I shall play something to clear the mind of medieval manuscripts and hidden passages. Mozart, I think. Something rational and orderly to restore equilibrium after the Baroque complexities of the past week." As the first notes filled our sitting room pure and clean, I completed my final sentence with satisfaction. In that silent library, it was not noise but assumption that deceived us. Holmes taught me again that truth hides not in what is dramatic, but in what quietly refuses to fit. I set my pen aside and listened to the music, content in the knowledge that another case had been brought to its proper conclusion, another mystery solved, another small triumph of reason over confusion. The case would be recorded as The Secret of the Midnight Library, and in years to come readers might find in it some useful instruction about the nature of deception and the power of careful observation. But for now, it was enough simply to be home, the fire warm, the music soothing, and my friend satisfied with work well done. Outside, London carried on in all its vast complexity, doubtless harbouring mysteries yet unsolved, crimes yet uncommitted, and puzzles waiting to test the remarkable faculties of Sherlock Holmes. But those were adventures for another day.